What's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about the Focal ELEX and the Beyerdynamic DT1990. And I kind of want to do a comparison of these two headphones for a couple of reasons. One, they are both relatively even measuring headphones, and they both represent an interesting place in the $500 to $1,000 market. And I think if you're considering buying the 1990, the Focal is not that far up in cost. And I'm going to describe the sound as best as I can between these two, and maybe that might help influence you to make a decision one way or the other on which one you prefer. The Beyerdynamic is always available on Amazon, and a slight caveat to the ELEX is that it's only available on mass drop for select time periods when they're actually on drop, so they're not available 100% of the time. But let's just assume for this example that they're both available. And before we get started, I want to mention that the DT1990 is my own, and the ELEX was sent in by a viewer and a friend of the channel. So all thoughts and opinions are my own. I'm not paid, asked, or otherwise influenced to say anything particular about these headphones. And then the second thing is I actually have full reviews of each of these headphones individually, links in the description down below. So when I'm describing sound, saying more bass, more treble, less treble, etc., it's in comparison to the other headphone, not as a headphone individually. Let's talk about the build. This to me is a complete toss-up. The ELEX weighing 450 grams versus the 1990's 370 grams. The 1990 is a lighter headphone, but the ELEX has a better pad and headband material. The Beyerdynamic seems to have better build quality in terms of robustness. It's made with more liberal amounts of metal in terms of the cups themselves. The hinges are also very, very well produced. The ELEX is what I would consider to be more luxurious, and the other is more robust. So decide for yourself on what you define as better. For comfort, I think this is also going to go case by case, head to head. The ELEX definitely has better pad and headband material, but it is heavier, whereas the 1990 is lighter, but the pad's surface area is not as great. So your mileage and comfort is going to vary depending on your head shape and size and whether or not you have a sensitive head. For me, even things like LCDXs really aren't heavy enough for me to complain about it. So I'm not really sensitive to a lot of like clamping pressure issues or anything like some people do experience. Regarding the power requirements, the ELEX is far easier to drive. It has an impedance rating of 80 ohms and a sound pressure level of 104 decibels. And the 1990 has an impedance rating of 250 ohms and a sound pressure level of 101 decibels. Now onto the sound portion. Now I tested both of these out of the single-ended quarter inch that they come with. It's worth noting that the ELEX actually does come with an included balance cable that you can also use if you have a balanced amplifier. I do have a lot of balanced amplifiers here that I tested on, among them being the Mjolnir 2, the NFB 1 amp, the THX 789, and the Schiit Jotunheim. And I tested out of the single-ended only because the DT1990 is only capable of single-ended because it has only one 3-pin mini XLR connector, so it's incapable of running balanced without modification. So overall, the biggest difference of these two is presentation. They present sound to you in completely different manners, and that's going to be the biggest difference for what you're going to get with these headphones. So I'm going to spend a big portion on imaging in Soundstage and how sound actually approaches your ears. But for now, let's go ahead and go down the normal list of treble, bass response, mids, all that fun stuff, starting with treble. So the 1990 has what I would consider to be more crystalline high-end above 10K. And that's due to the treble above 10K being a little bit more forward on the DT1990 and a little bit boosted compared to the ELEX. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean enjoyment all of the time. The 1990, while a very good technical headphone in the high end, that Tesla driver is just insane for resolution there, it can be fatiguing without modifications. And I think it's also worth mentioning, since these are my 1990s, normally I have them modded. I use them with the analytical pads that kind of makes them a little bit more stark sounding than the balance pads that they come with. And I put an extra piece of foam to cool down the brightness and the highs and bring up the bass a little bit. But for this test, I took out the foam and I'm actually using the balance pads, even though they're not really balanced. They're kind of a little bit bassier and a little bit sharper in the treble. But I felt like the balance pads were better for a comparison aspect in terms of some parts of the bass response that we'll talk about in a second. And I just went with the balance pads instead. So that's what I'm comparing. But back to the 1990s treble, it's kind of just at the limit of what I consider to be too much. It's not quite there. It's just like one or two notches below that. The ELEX to me has a very easy to listen to, very even treble performance. And while very, very crisp as a headphone individually, I think the 1990 is perhaps a little bit better there. Now, regarding the mid-range, the ELEX is a lot more focused and forward, and regarding the intimacy of the entire sound signature, which again, I'll talk more about in a second, the ELEX is a much more intimate headphone. And the vocals follow suit with that sound signature to where they are very intimate and very compact and very kind of in your face. But while the ELEX has the upper hand in terms of intimacy and focus, the mid-range in the DT1990 seems fuller. But both I would consider to be fairly evenly textured in terms of vocals, and the separation is, I would actually call the vocals more obvious on the ELEX, but the separation better on the DT1990. I think it separates from the background a little bit better and a little bit more, but it's not as easily accessible in its entirety like the ELEX is. And because of how the vocals come across and how the Soundstage come across on both headphones have songs that they sound perfect in, where the other headphone falls a little bit behind, and vice versa. The other headphone will have a song that sounds amazing in, and the other headphone falls a little flat. So for these headphones, it kind of goes case by case for vocals on which one's better, just depending on the song you're playing. Now, regarding the bass response, the 1990, especially with the balance pads, has a stronger bass performance. It's richer, and it's without the loss of detail or position as well. The bass performance is very commendable on the 1990 as a headphone as a whole. But on the flip side, the ELEX has kind of a flatter bass response. It's very detailed, and from a clinical standpoint, from an analytical standpoint, from a purity standpoint, the ELEX is probably a better reference for bass. Both hit very low and have little to no roll off. The 1990 has a slightly elevated bass from what I would consider to be perfectly neutral. And even with the less bassy analytical pads, I still think the bass response is a little bit more pleasing to the ear in terms of enjoyment for the 1990, but the ELEX, like said before, is going to be the better reference headphone. Okay, now let's talk about the real fun stuff, because both are highly capable of reproducing frequencies very accurately. They have no serious caveats to their sound on either headphone in terms of frequency response, or the capability of reproducing the sound or tonality of an instrument. So presentation is really where the magic happens for both of these headphones, and they both have their own presentation nuances. And I'm going to try my best to describe what those are. So like I said before, the overall sound signature of the ELEX is intimate compared to the 1990. The 1990 Soundstage feels more natural and wide, but the ELEX isn't a slouch and feels natural within its given soundstage, just a hair less wide, except for the vocals. The vocals are comparatively more forward given the soundstage. If we move the soundstage to the same area, same width, the vocals on the ELEX seem to be even closer than they would be on the 1990. So the forwardness and intimacy factor there is definitely, in my opinion, in favor of the ELEX. But as said before, there's caveats and different benefits to each headphone when it comes to vocals. But in terms of presentation, I think the ELEX is a little bit better, although separation is a tiny bit in favor of the 1990. The imaging is interesting, and before I get into this, because I think people are going to get really up in arms about this, I think that both headphones have some of the best imaging for any headphone. I think the edge goes to the 1990. I think even though the soundstage is wider, and generally when you widen the soundstage and things get further out, the imaging tends to get a little less precise. That doesn't seem to be an issue on the 1990. And I think when it comes to the totality of an exacting position, I think the 1990 can do it better. But I do think that the field of sound is different on these headphones, and I made a little visual display to show you exactly kind of what I mean. And if it doesn't work out on this angle, I'll shoot it from a different angle. So in black, we have the 1990. In the center, we have a head looking from the top down. And then in green, we have the ELEX sound field. Now, the ELEX is a sound field that sounds very, very circular, kind of all the way around your head. Obviously, it goes out a little bit further in front of your head than it appears in the back. Same thing with the DT1990. It doesn't quite have a rear performance nearly as well as does have a side or a forward performance. Now, this is obviously not precise, but to me, the sound on the ELEX seems to have a more even rounding delivery in terms of the imaging and the soundstage. While the 1990 is capable of going further to the sides on both right and left, and capable of going to the center, but it's a little bit weaker in that kind of 45-degree angle on both sides, right and left. And this potentially could be seen as a bad thing, or it could be seen as a good thing depending on how you're looking at it. I think this is one of the key factors for having better separation, because I think instruments tend to take more of a, while they can very much sound like they're coming from in front of you, and I don't mean to make them sound like they don't, I think that when you're talking about how the sound is represented in terms of background instruments, they seem to have a better side profile than they do a rear profile in terms of the singer being the focus. And then you get this really great, awesome center image that's very far in front and very finite. And that's where the kind of the singer lies, and the instruments are a little bit more surrounding. Whereas the ELEX, and this could be a little bit more perhaps accurate or even, or kind of a, I guess even would be the best term. The ELEX tends to not have as great a separation, but it does seem to have less noticeable low points in terms of imaging and soundstage. And it seems to be as accurate in front of you as it is on the sides and at 45 degrees, etc. Whereas the 1990 seems to be very good, even at 45 degrees, even at its weak points, it's very, very good, but it's phenomenal at the places that it's good at, being directly in front and directly to the sides. It's super precise in those categories. So I'm not sure if that makes any sense to anybody but me. And I'm sorry for my little terrible 5-year-old drawing, but yeah, I thought it'd help a little bit at least. All right, so in conclusion, both headphones are amazing in their entirety. They are highly capable, highly fun, highly accurate headphones, and they're some of the best headphones that I've heard, period. My preference is the DT1990 for what I like. However, I can fully concede that the ELEX is a more accurate headphone and is a better, perhaps a better reference for certain categories depending on what you're looking at. But if you're looking at the overall picture, I think the ELEX is it just takes it by a little bit. And I think for certain people, that's going to be absolutely perfect. I think enjoyment is highly personal. And I think what I find enjoyable is not necessarily what you're going to find enjoyable, and so on to the next person, to the next person, to the next person. And if you're one of those people who where accuracy and a perfect reference or a nearly perfect reference is enjoyment, then I would go with the ELEX. If you're somebody who likes a mixture between it's still a very highly accurate headphone, don't get me wrong. But if you want a good mix of fun and a good sound and a very, what I consider to be, and this is a slippery slope for definitions, but I consider the 1990 to be a very musical sounding headphone while still very accurate, whereas the ELEX comes across extremely accurate, but a little stark and perhaps even a little bit dry. So what you consider enjoyable is going to put you in one of two camps here. So hopefully I helped make a decision if you're interested in either one of these headphones. All right, guys, if you like what you see and you want to see more, please consider hitting that subscribe button. And if you really like the channel, there is a Patreon option if you do want to help support me financially in my endeavors here. And I guess I will catch you in the next video.